Welcome to the Talk Like a Leader podcast, where we explore the mindset, skill set, and habit set of leadership communication. Using these tips, techniques, and tactics, you'll be able to talk like a leader to build better relationships and get more done. Your host is Guy Harris, who has more than 20 years of combined professional and military experience in consulting, coaching, and training in areas like team and interaction dynamics, communication strategies and tactics, as well as emotional intelligence. Take it away, Guy.
Hi, this is Guy Harris. Welcome to the Talk Like a Leader podcast. This week's episode, we're going to talk about the do's and don'ts of coaching conversations. And before we get into the specifics of the 3 tips of what not to do and what to do in coaching conversations, I'd like to define for you the difference between coaching and discipline, because I know that in many organizations, coaching has a very specific definition, often applied in what I would call a disciplinary situation rather than a coaching situation. So for our purposes today, I want to make sure we're really clear on what I mean by coaching. Coaching and discipline both really are conversations with another person about their performance, their results, their specific workplace behaviors in an effort to help them improve those behaviors and results. So what is the difference between coaching and discipline? Well, if you think about where people fit in your organization and kind of imagine that there's a scale of performance that at the top of this scale would be awesome performance. A person is doing everything right. They're doing exactly what they're supposed to do. They're getting great results. At the bottom of the scale, there'll be people that are, they're about to get fired. So everybody is between termination and awesome in every organization, everywhere. Now, what we'd like is for everyone to be at awesome. And we know that not everyone is always at the awesome level of performance. We will occasionally run into people who are not quite at awesome. So how do we help them move forward? Well, the key to that is effective coaching conversations that are designed to help the person understand the gap in their performance and how they can improve it. The challenge is that many coaching conversations sound disciplinary when they should be coaching. So we're back to the question, what's the difference between coaching and discipline? On the scale of performance between termination and awesome, somewhere close to termination, probably a little bit of a gap between termination and this line, you'll find the minimum performance line, meaning there's some minimum performance that you're just not willing to accept in the organization. And there's probably a little bit of a gap between that and termination, meaning that probably you're not going to immediately fire someone just because they momentarily or in one specific instance dip below the minimum line. So there's a pretty big gap between minimum and awesome. And if you think about the performance scale, if somebody's above the minimum, then there's really not much room for discipline because you're not prepared to fire them. In fact, what discipline would you offer? You can't really punish somebody for being above the minimum. What you can do is coach them and encourage them and draw them towards awesome. So the difference between coaching and discipline really falls into the difference between are they above or below the minimum acceptable line, meaning would I fire them over this behavior? If you're not going to fire them, maybe you're just mildly frustrated or annoyed, then you have to be careful how you engage in the conversation, because if your frustration or annoyance enters the conversation, it sounds to the person hearing it like discipline. Well, then what's the problem with discipline conversations? Discipline conversations basically drive a person to do just enough to avoid the discipline. And if you sound like you're disciplining a person when you should be coaching the person, it will have the effect of getting them to do just enough to avoid more of the same conversation. It won't really create for them a feeling of accountability or ownership in the new set of behaviors or results that we really want to encourage in people. So I'd say that coaching is any conversation above the minimum line, and it means that I'm not going to even talk about whether their job's in jeopardy or not. There is an opportunity to improve their performance, yes, and the gap between good and awesome is just a gap between good and awesome. It's not a choice between good and bad. We're talking about getting better from good or acceptable, not necessarily getting out of bad. And we have to be careful that we don't let our own frustration with the gap turn into a conversation that sounds like we're angry, when in fact all we're trying to do is encourage the person to improve. And ultimately, the goal of a coaching conversation is not so much to hold a person accountable as it is to create for that person a feeling of accountability and ownership in the outcome, results, or changes that we're talking about. So the goal of coaching is to create in another person a feeling of accountability and ownership. It is not about holding them accountable to a standard. Discipline is about holding people accountable to a standard. Coaching is about creating a sense of accountability. So what are the do's and don'ts of coaching conversations? If we're trying to create in the other person a sense or a feeling of accountability and ownership that they will then act on when we're not present, hopefully with positive motivators drawing them forward rather than negative motivators pushing them ahead, we want to avoid the don'ts, and I'll say them quickly. Don't focus on the person. Don't spend too much time talking about the past, and don't ask why. When you focus on the person and their personal behavior, it's likely to back them into a threat response, which will feel like discipline to them, and not likely invite them to take ownership. If you spend too much time talking about the past, it's going to gravitate into blame, shame, and criticism rather than improvement and movement forward. And if you ask why, meaning you say something like this, why did you do that? Why would you think that? Why does that seem reasonable to you? Any kind of why question in that frame is likely to sound, again, accusatory and blaming to the person rather than encouraging and supporting. What do you do instead? After all, we're trying to get the person to change their behavior, so it ultimately is about the person. And we're trying to change something that happened in the past so it doesn't happen again in the future. So we're reflecting on the past so we can learn how to do better in the future. And we kind of do want to know why they did it so that we don't do it again. The key is that we can't focus on the person or spend time talking about the past or asking why. We have to do something different. What we want to do is we want to focus on the process or the mission or the big picture. We want to talk about the future. We want to ask what and how. Focusing on the process and asking what and how are really sort of connected ideas, meaning I don't want to ask why this person did what they did. I want to talk with them about what the mission is and how this matters. I want to talk with them about what came to them or what they knew at a particular time rather than why they did it. I want to ask them how the information came to them. I want to ask them how the behavior affects the process. And I want to talk about what we're going to do next time rather than what we did last time. So it might sound something like this. Now, you'll have to adjust it to your specific situation. But I'll give you one poorly phrased coaching conversation, and I will then give you a simple, maybe not perfect, I would say better phrased way to talk about the situation. Rather than go to a person and say, well, here's what happened. That's not really good. Why did you do that in the past? Why did you do that in the past? What I want to do instead is to say something like this. I noticed that this is a result we got in the past, and it seems like there's a gap between that and what we're trying to achieve. Our mission here is to achieve X results, and you're a really big part of making that happen. What could we do together, or how could we make sure in the future that we achieve these results? Or how could we in the future make sure that you have the right information at the time you make the decision? Or how could we improve this process so you have the tools you need to make things better in the future? Any of those fulfill the basic requirements. Now, I'm talking in broad generalities, yet you have to fill in the gaps with specific situations. And hopefully you get the big idea for what we're talking about. What we want to do is avoid focusing on the person and what they did or didn't do. We want to avoid talking about the past because there's nothing a person can do to change it. We want to avoid asking why because it feels like blame, shame, and criticism. Focusing on the person, talking about the past, and asking why tend to trigger a threat response, tends to feel like a disciplinary conversation with the person, not likely to invite them to help you solve the problem and own the solution in the future. If we can focus on the process or the mission or the big picture or how we missed our mission or we're missing our goal and how we can make that better in the future and invite them into solving the problem in the future and ask them what and how we can do differently in the future. If you do those three things, focus on the process or the mission or the big picture, talk about the future, and ask what and how, you can talk like a leader. This has been the Talk Like a Leader podcast. You can listen to this show every week wherever you get your podcast. If you haven't, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. I'm Guy Harris, and thanks for listening.